It was a regular Tuesday night in Manhattan. A popular political talk show was live, and millions of Americans were watching, expecting the usual back-and-forth arguments and fiery sound bites. But what they saw that night was something completely different, something that would stop the entire country in its tracks. The guest that evening was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. He wasn't there to make waves, just to talk about African independence and America's role in West Africa. A serious topic, but nothing dramatic. Across from him sat Karoline Leavitt, a former political spokesperson known for her sharp words and tough attitude. The producers had planned a respectful conversation. But live television doesn't always go to plan. About 20 minutes into the show, Captain Traoré was calmly and clearly explaining his country's position on foreign influence in Africa. His tone was steady. His words were thoughtful. Nothing controversial, just facts. Then, out of nowhere, Karoline leaned in, pointed her finger and snapped at him with two words that shocked the nation. "Sit down, boy." The room went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. Even the host was speechless. Viewers at home were stunned. Social media exploded within seconds. But here's the part no one saw coming. Captain Traoré didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he stood up, not in defiance, but with quiet strength. He walked to the front of the stage, looked out at the stunned audience, and spoke in a soft voice. So soft, in fact, that everyone leaned in to hear him. "I come from a place," he said, "where boys must become men before they've had a chance to dream." The cameras zoomed in. Not a single person moved. Then he turned to Karoline. "You can call me boy here on your stage," he said, "but where I'm from, boys carry nations on their backs. They protect others from going hungry. They lead because there is no one else." The look on Karoline's face changed instantly. Her usual confidence faded. She realized this wasn't someone she could talk down to. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was real life. And Captain Traoré wasn't finished. He looked down for a moment, then spoke again, even softer than before. "I buried my father under the open sky," he said. "No cameras, no speeches, just dirt, silence, and the sound of my mother's pain." In the front row, an elderly black woman wiped tears from her face. This wasn't about winning an argument anymore. This was about truth, dignity, and what it really means to carry responsibility with honor, even when the world isn't watching. That moment didn't just silence a TV studio. It silenced America. What happened next on that live talk show wasn't just dramatic. It was real, raw, and deeply human. Millions of Americans were watching, and suddenly they were faced with something they didn't expect: the unfiltered truth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré kept speaking, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "He was killed during a coup," he said quietly, referring to a loved one. A coup funded by foreign powers. He glanced briefly at Karoline. She looked uncomfortable now, her eyes darting around the room, no longer in control. "So, when you say, 'Sit down, boy,'" he asked, "do you mean the boy who watched his village burn? The boy who studied by candlelight because the electricity never came back after colonialism left?" It hit the room like a wave. One of the panelists, a retired decorated U.S. Army veteran, quietly placed his hand over his heart. You could see it in his eyes. He understood. He recognized the burden of service, of sacrifice. Captain Traoré's voice remained steady, though his eyes were glassy. "You don't have to like me," he said, turning to the camera and speaking directly to everyone watching at home. "But you will not erase me." A single clap rang out from the back of the studio, then another. And suddenly, the entire audience was on its feet, not clapping, out of sympathy, but out of deep respect. This wasn't a performance, it was something real. And for the first time since the show began, Karoline Leavitt looked small, not belittled, but humbled. Then came a moment even more powerful. Captain Traoré lowered his eyes briefly, choosing his words carefully. When he looked up, there was no anger left in him, only something deeper. "You see a soldier," he said softly, "but I was raised by a woman who worked with her bare hands." He paused. "My mother sold firewood. She walked miles in worn-out sandals so I could go to school. She went hungry so I wouldn't have to. She never said sit down. She said stand up, even when it hurt." The camera cut to Karoline again. Her smirk was gone. In the front row, a little girl turned to her father and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "He sounds like you, Daddy." That's when you saw grown men in the studio wiping their eyes. Captain Traoré continued, "So when someone like you calls me boy, you're not insulting me, you're insulting every mother who carried a nation on her back." The silence after those words wasn't awkward. It was meaningful. Even the host looked emotional. Then something unexpected happened. The U.S. Army veteran on the panel, Colonel Jacob Whitmore, a man with white hair, medals, and decades of service, stood up. His voice shook a little as he spoke. "He's right," the colonel said, turning toward the audience. "I served in Liberia. I've seen what boys like him face. Calling him boy, that's not a debate. That's humiliation. What you said dishonors the brave men and women I served with in Africa." The room fell completely silent. Colonel Whitmore walked over to Captain Traoré and extended his hand. "Captain," he said, "thank you, not just for defending your people, but for reminding us what real leadership looks like." The two men shook hands as the nation watched and felt something real. As the crowd stood clapping once again, this time with tears in their eyes, there was a quiet shift in the room. Even people who had never heard of Burkina Faso felt something powerful and real. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't ready to back down. Her face flushed red as she realized she was losing control. This wasn't how she thought it would go. She expected applause, maybe even praise from her supporters. Instead, it was all falling apart, live in front of millions. Frustrated and desperate, she blurted out, "Oh, come on. Are we seriously pretending he's a saint now?" The audience visibly recoiled. People gasped. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stayed calm. He looked at her and replied softly, "This isn't about sainthood. It's about humanity." Karoline, now flustered, looked to the host for help, but he just stared at her, stunned. "What's next?" she snapped. "We apologize for being Americans." That's when a young black student in the crowd stood up. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "No, you apologize for being cruel." The room went silent. It wasn't just a comment. It was a wound being exposed. You could feel it in the air. Karoline had completely misread the moment. Her confidence was unraveling. She had underestimated Captain Traoré, and now her words were turning against her. As Captain Traoré sat back down, the camera zoomed in. He wasn't angry. He was calm. And that calm made him even more powerful in that moment. The young student sat down too, still watching Karoline closely. The entire room had shifted. This wasn't just a talk show anymore. This was a moment of truth that people would remember for years. Karoline tried to save face with a forced laugh. "Oh, come on. This is America. We're allowed to disagree." But no one laughed. The camera showed the audience, some wiping their eyes, others holding their hands over their hearts. Captain Traoré leaned forward again. "Disagreement is healthy," he said gently, "but disrespect kills the conversation. And when you kill the conversation, you kill understanding." The applause that followed was different, slower, more emotional. It felt like something was ending. like the old way of talking to each other had been challenged. Maybe even changed. Karoline sat frozen. Then Captain Traoré did something no one expected. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded, worn letter, creased and torn at the edges. "This was written by my younger brother," he said quietly. 2 days before he was killed during a protest. He was protesting for food. The studio fell completely silent. Even the applause stopped. Captain Traoré carefully unfolded the letter. His hands were steady, but the weight of what he was holding was clear. The host leaned forward, visibly moved. "He wrote," Traoré said, "Big brother, if I die, promise me they won't forget why." He held the letter up to the light. People in the crowd gasped. Some began to cry openly. Then he looked up, his voice firm and full of emotion. "So no, I won't sit down. Because I carry the memory of those who can't stand anymore." And just like that, silence returned to the studio. Not awkward, but sacred. It was no longer about politics, it was about truth. And the whole country was watching. Karoline sat frozen. Her hands trembled under the table. She blinked rapidly, struggling to keep her composure. For the first time, she had nothing to say. Meanwhile, outside the studio, the clip was already going viral. Millions were watching and sharing it online with one simple word: watch. But the night wasn't over. As Captain Traoré carefully folded the letter from his late brother and tucked it back into his pocket, a deep silence filled the studio. Even the crew had stopped moving. No whispers, no rustling papers, no phones clicking, just stillness. The kind that only happens when something important is unfolding. Finally, the host broke the silence. "Captain Traoré," he said gently, "is there anything you'd like to say to the American people watching tonight?" Captain Traoré looked straight into the camera, his calm presence still unwavering. "You don't need to know where Burkina Faso is to understand dignity," he said. "You just need to know what it feels like to be invisible." He leaned slightly closer to the camera. "I've never asked for pity. I only ask for eyes that can truly see." Karoline's jaw clenched. Her entire plan to dominate, to humiliate, had fallen apart. She was no longer the focus. Captain Traoré hadn't taken control with volume or aggression. He'd done it with truth. Then something unexpected happened. One of the camera operators quietly stepped away from his equipment, walked onto the stage, and approached Captain Traoré. He reached out, shook his hand, and said loud enough for the microphones to catch, "Thank you for reminding me what honor looks like." The studio didn't move. It was as if time had stopped. Then, from the third row, a middle-aged black woman slowly stood. She didn't wait to be called on. She just began to speak, her voice soft but clear. "I didn't come here to speak," she said, "but I need to say this." All eyes turned to her. Even the cameras shifted. "My son served in Afghanistan," she continued. "He came back in a box." Her voice cracked under the weight of that sentence. He was called boy, too, even in uniform. She turned to Captain Traoré, tears running down her cheeks. "When you spoke, it felt like my son stood up again." The sound that followed wasn't just gasps. It was the sound of a nation feeling something it had forgotten. Shared humanity. The room was so quiet. You could hear people crying, and even through the television speakers, the camera zoomed in on Captain Traoré. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, silently sharing the pain of the grieving mother standing before him. Karoline Leavitt looked like she wanted to jump in, but even she seemed to realize this moment wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to something bigger, something far beyond politics, headlines, or ratings. Then the mother added one more sentence that broke the room wide open. "America needs men like you." not loudmouths who talk over pain. The audience stood up and erupted into applause, not out of excitement, but from deep respect. It wasn't a show anymore, it had turned into something larger, a collective moment of reflection on how we treat each other, how we listen, and how we honor dignity in every person, no matter where they come from. Karoline had had enough. She leaned into her mic, visibly frustrated. "This is a setup," she snapped. "This isn't journalism. It's emotional theater." The host turned slowly toward her. Then calmly, he took out his earpiece and replied, "Karoline, the cameras are still rolling. You created this moment. You just didn't expect it to answer you back." Furious, she slammed her cue cards down on the desk, stood up and said, "I don't need this circus." Then she stormed off the set, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, echoing like distant gunfire. The audience didn't boo. They didn't cheer either. They just watched her leave, in total silence. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a quiet voice said what millions of people at home were already thinking. She couldn't handle the truth. The camera slowly panned back to Captain Traoré, still sitting, still calm. "I didn't come here to shame her," he said softly. "I came here to tell the truth." The host, visibly moved, cleared his throat. "Well, the truth is sitting in that chair." As Captain Traoré sat quietly, the world kept watching. During the commercial break, the studio was buzzing. Producers scrambled, phones rang non-stop, and emails poured in from media outlets around the globe. Then a message arrived from the White House press team. Just 3 words. "We saw everything." No one knew exactly what it meant, but everyone knew it was important. When the show returned from break, the host leaned in once again. "Captain Traoré," he asked, "do you believe America can truly hear voices like yours?" "Captain." Traoré looked into the camera, calm and steady. "Yes," he said, "but first, America has to be willing to listen, even when it's uncomfortable." Then he shared a story no one saw coming. "Last year, I visited a children's hospital in Chicago. An 8-year-old girl had drawn 2 flags side by side, one from Burkina Faso and one from the U.S. She said to me, 'You're both fighting for us.'" The camera panned to the audience. Many were wiping away tears. "That child," he continued softly, "understood more about unity than most world leaders ever will." And in that moment, something clicked across the country. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about heart, about humanity, about recognizing each other's dignity, even through disagreement. By the end of the night, the video had gone viral in ways no one could have imagined. People were pausing dinner, turning up the volume, and calling their families to watch. Phones were passed around in kitchens, living rooms, subways, and barbershops across America. The phrase, "Shut sit down, boy," once intended as an insult, became a movement, but not against Captain Traoré. Instead, it sparked a wave of national reflection. Social media overflowed with personal reactions. My dad called me crying, said it reminded him of 1963. I showed this to my students. Half the class couldn't stop crying. I didn't even know who Captain Traoré was an hour ago. Now I want to be like him. A teen from Atlanta. What was supposed to be a public takedown had become something no one expected, a national awakening. Then, just before the host could ask his final question, something incredible happened. A white-haired veteran in the audience slowly stood up. He wore a military uniform, held a cane in one hand, and had medals on his chest. His voice shook as he spoke. "I served in Vietnam. I lost friends. I came home angry. I watched this country tear itself apart more than once." He pointed gently toward Captain Traoré. "But never, in all my years, have I seen a man stay so gracious after being treated like that." Then, facing the camera, he added, "America doesn't just owe him an apology. America owes him respect." No one clapped. There were only tears. Even the host lowered his head, overcome with emotion. Captain Traoré stood and walked over to the veteran. They shook hands, two soldiers from different worlds, sharing a truth deeper than words. That image, too, would go viral. Because sometimes the most powerful revolution begins not with anger, but with someone simply being heard. And just as the broadcast was about to end, just as the show was winding down, the host received a note. He read it, and his eyes widened. "Captain Traoré," he said with surprise, "we have a special guest joining us on video." The screen lit up, and there she was, the same little girl from the Chicago hospital, waving a red, white, and green paper flag. "Hi, Captain," she said, beaming. "You remembered me." The room melted. Grown adults wiped their eyes. "You told me I was brave," she continued, her smile glowing. "But tonight, you were the bravest." The audience broke. Tears flowed openly. Even the host dabbed his eyes with a tissue and whispered off mic, "My daughter's the same age." Captain Traoré placed his hand over his heart. His lips trembled, eyes shining. "You give me strength," he said softly. "You are the future I fight for." She nodded proudly, then said something that made the moment unforgettable. "Next time someone says, 'Sit down, boy,' I'll tell them, 'Stand up like Captain Traoré.'" The screen faded. The audience didn't just applaud. They rose to their feet. This wasn't TV anymore. This was history. That night, Captain Traoré sat alone in his Washington hotel room. His phone was buzzing with messages from world leaders, celebrities, veterans, mothers, and children. But it was a handwritten letter, slipped under his door, that made him pause and hold his breath. It was from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. It read, "Dear Captain Traoré, tonight, you didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for every soul who was ever told to, 'Sit down, boy.' We are preparing a permanent exhibition titled Dignity Under Fire. We would be honored to feature your words, your story, and the moment that changed the world." He set the letter down, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Not for me, for all of them." Outside, crowds were gathering, not in protest, but simply to say thank you. A week later, something unexpected happened. Karoline Leavitt returned to the same studio. No cameras, no makeup, no audience. Just her and a folded note. She asked the producer to give it to Captain Traoré. He opened it the next day at a press conference. It read, "I said, 'Sit down, boy,' and you stood taller than any man I've ever seen. I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope your people, and my daughter, grow up in a world that learns from your strength, not my ignorance." The room went silent. Captain Traoré looked up. "We don't heal through silence," he said. "We heal through courage." And today, she showed some. From that moment on, even his toughest critics called him by a new name, the man who made America listen. The show returned to its regular schedule. The world moved on. But one thing stayed the same. An empty chair, placed at center stage where Captain Traoré once sat. It has no name, no sign. But everyone who sees it knows exactly what it means. It means dignity. It means courage. It means that one man from Burkina Faso walked into a storm and came out a symbol of what's possible when we choose grace over anger, truth over performance, and humanity over hate. Later that year, Captain Traoré spoke at the United Nations, but it wasn't his speech that went viral. It was what he held in his hand, a small, handmade American flag drawn by that same 8-year-old girl. "This was given to me by a child," he said, "who believed I stood for something good. That means more than any medal. Then he looked into the camera one last time. America. Don't just clap, change. So now I want to ask you, what part of this story moved you most? Was it when he spoke about his mother selling firewood, the letter from his brother, that brave little girl and her flag? Drop a comment and tell us what gave you chills, and if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that truth, dignity, and grace still matter. Hit that subscribe button. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We tell stories that change the way you see the world. Thanks for watching. And remember, never sit down when it's time to stand up for what's right.